In the book of Ephesians, and what our series is going to be about is, if we were going to title the series, and then each Sunday we preach, we'll look at a kind of a subcategory of it. So we're going to talk about a worthy walk. Now, the Bible specifically refers to a worthy walk 4 times. So that tells you how many Sundays we might be preaching on this subject. Hint, hint. The Bible talks about a worthy walk. Now, when I think of that word worthy, right before I was getting ready to preach, I had to look this up, because when I think of people getting things that they don't deserve, now, I don't typically, speak about political things. Of our current president, him presidential pardons to over 1,500 convicted felons. He pardoned 1,500 individuals, and 39 of them were on death row, meaning they had done something so terrible that even in this century, the jury said they need to die. And our president pardoned them. They're not worthy of that pardon. And then I was quickly looking through. Of course, he just gave out the Presidential Medal of Honor to 19 individuals. Now, typically, now if you were to get one, I don't know if it would mean anything. It's kind of like they ruin it when they give it this, it's like everybody's a winner, everybody gets a trophy. I don't know that I want one. And typically, the president will find citizens who had donated or altered or helped the country or humanity so much that there was no way to thank them other than for the President of the United States to say, "We recognize what you have done for this country." He gave it to Hillary Clinton. If you don't know, okay, apparently you don't know this. Okay, let's go through this. He gave it to Hillary Clinton. He gave it to George Soros. If you don't know anything about this, I'm just telling you. He gave it to Lionel Messi. Now, if I'm messing up these names, I'm sorry. I don't. Messiah. Did I mess it up that bad? Is it Messiah? Okay. All right. I'm sorry. That tells you how important they are. It was because of his he gave it to him because of his excellence in sports. So you get a Presidential Medal of Honor for that. Bono, the lead singer of U2, if you know anything about that band, they are ungodly. I'll just leave it at that. Denzel Washington for his activism and contribution to the movie arts. Michael J. Fox. I couldn't help but laugh. Jane Goodall, the lady responsible for the chimpanzee studies. They're worthy of that? I don't think so. But I guess I'm not the guy who gets to give out the medals, right? Magic Johnson, Ralph Lauren for his contributions to art and design. You could design a line of clothing and you get that. Bill Nye, the science guy, not even a real scientist. He got it. Let's see here. There's more. You get the idea. When I think of individuals getting the highest honor that our country can bestow on a citizen, not a single one of them that I read. Now, I didn't read through them all. Not one of them, I don't think they're worthy of that. Now, here comes the second part of this quarter that we've been looking at. Do you deserve, are you worthy of salvation? The highest honor a creator could bestow upon his creation. And that's the subject that we're going to be studying here today. And it's something that we're given. Now, Paul has to talk about, are you worthy of that? Ephesians chapter number 4, Look what it says in verse number 1. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that ye walk worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called. I'm going to give you a quick little history about the church at Ephesus. Now, Ephesus was a city. It kind of controlled a region, but it was one of the 4 largest cities during this time period. It was a powerhouse for economics. It'd be like, when we talk about important cities in our economics, we know, obviously, San Francisco, San Diego, LA, those are important cities because of all the economy that comes in and out of that, the ports. We could talk about important cities on the East Coast. Not only for economics, it was a huge religious epicenter of ungodly religious epicenter. They had most of the Greek gods. Their main worship was found and taught there at Ephesus. It, at this time of Paul's writing, had 250,000 people in population. That's a pretty good sized city for back then. It was located on the coast. They had ports, and it was just a huge, huge city, and it controlled a lot when it came to the world in Paul's time. Now, Paul, he stopped there and was able to see some folks get saved. He was able to start a small church there. And Ephesus was obviously not located in Israel. And so the primary people group that you would find in Ephesus was not Jewish people. It was just kind of a conglomerate of all kinds of people because it was a port city. And so there was mainly just Gentiles there, all right? There wasn't a lot of Jews. There was a few, but primarily it was just a Gentile center, all right? And so Paul was able to get a church started there. He spent several years there. At one point, he spent about 3 years there trying to get the church going, and he would stop there on his journeys through his second and third missionary journey and kind of get refreshed and kind of help this church. This church wasn't huge by any means. It wasn't like the church at Jerusalem where there was literally thousands of members. It was kind of a church maybe about this size, they think, and just based off of the history and what they find in writings. It wasn't a huge church, but it was a church that God was working in. And that's what you want, all right? When you're looking for a church, just because it has a lot of people doesn't mean God is working. And I said this earlier. You want to be in a church where God is working. I invited a gentleman to church a few months back. He came only one time. I ran into him at a gas station, and he says, I'm looking for a church where I can really get along with everybody and where I can really get along with the pastor and follow him. And, I've been to churches where it's really hard to follow the pastor. And so, in the back of your head, you have thoughts while people are talking. And in the back of my head, I was like, oh boy, he has no idea what he's in for when he comes to our church, because you have to really think when you come to our church. And I was like, well, we're not. I always tell people this. I say, we're not a perfect church, but I believe we're a church where God is working. And that's the church. I don't want to look for a church where I get along with people. That's good. But I want to be in a church where God is working. Because if God is working, we're going to get along. And see, that should go first. So God was working in this church at Ephesus. And so there's 6 chapters. It's a small book. Not a whole lot of doctrine is taught in it. There is some doctrine in there, of course, but it's not like a deep doctrinal book. But he's trying to help this church understand some things. Now, the Ephesians and Ephesus, they were a really pagan society. They had a goddess Diana, who was completely immoral. And so he discusses certain things specifically to a culture where women had this weird place in society and they were not morally taught growing up. It'd be like very similar to this day and age where things are overly sexualized at a young age. They're teaching. I had some family here from Canada, and my cousin, who'd be my cousin from my wife's side, she had to sign a document. What was the grade that they were wanting to teach that? Second grade, first grade, they're teaching sex education in first grade. That is very similar to this Ephesus culture, except this is just a little worse. We're getting there. And so sometimes when Paul teaches stuff and teaches things and talks about certain items, where talks about a woman should have covering and that's a good thing, talking about the hair, that's because in this culture that was not the thing. I just want to throw this plug in there. Why is it that when Trump won the election, all of the liberal women, their sign of rebellion was to shave their heads? If there's nothing to it, just thought I'd throw that. That's what you call a plug. You just throw that out there. That's extra. You didn't have to pay for that. There you go. That's bonus. But sometimes when you read these writings of Paul, he'll discuss things culturally. He's trying to address something. And maybe the ladies didn't understand that they were able to do certain things, and men needed to change their perspective of women and just culturally. And so in Ephesus, it was just a huge conglomerate of all kinds of weird teachings. And so in the first 3 chapters, Paul is trying to teach the Ephesians that God had a plan, and it was through the Jews. And God came to Abraham. And I'm not getting into the specifics, but he talks a little bit about predestination and the mystery that would be revealed. And some people think he's talking about salvation, predestination. It's not that. Well, in the first 3 chapters, he's trying to explain to the Gentiles that, hey, God had a plan through the Jewish people. And it's a beautiful mystery that's been revealed, is that Gentiles can be a part of the same family. Part of the children of Abraham. We're maybe not child of Israel, children of Jacob per se, but we're still part of God's plan. And it's a wonderful thing to be part of the plan. Nobody likes to be left out. And I would hate to be left out. Could you imagine coming to church today, and if you weren't a Jew, you couldn't find God, you couldn't see God? Wouldn't that feel terrible? And it wasn't quite that extreme in the Old Testament, but there were laws that if you weren't a born Jew, you couldn't enter certain parts of the tabernacle. You couldn't get close to God because there was that separation. And Paul, in the first 3 chapters, is letting the Gentiles know, hey, you can come close to God. You can be part of that mystery. And it's a beautiful thing. And I'm just telling you, being saved is a beautiful, wonderful thing. Man, to be able to go to heaven, to have our sins forgiven. Every day we have a God in heaven that has new mercies. They don't wear out. They don't get old. We get new ones every day. And that's what Paul's talking about in the first 3 chapters. Now, that's a wonderful thing. But he's reminding them now that God has given you something so wonderful, you need to be worthy of it. Not that we earn it. He doesn't say that you walk to earn your salvation. He says God's given you Gentiles. Now, if you're a Jew here today, it's still salvation's still the same to the Jew first and also to the Greek. We're all saved the same way. If you're saved, it's because you have accepted Christ as your Savior and you have asked Him to take you to heaven when you die. And it's not anything you could do outside of just Him. We're all saved the same way. But what happens back then and now is Christians kind of get over that hump, so to speak, where I am saved now. Now I can do whatever I want. Now I don't have to really be concerned about certain things. I'll just go to church once in a while. I'll give once in a while. And when it's convenient, I'll be a witness. That is what Paul is trying to address here to the Ephesians. And he's trying to get them to understand that their life needs to be different than the way it was. And he says that you need to walk worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called. Now, some may have the temptation. The devil likes to get on our shoulders once in a while and say, oh, he's talking about preachers and pastors and missionaries. And I'm just letting you know, he's not talking about that at all. He gets to that later in the chapter about how he gives gifts to men. But if you are a child of God, look, if you're saved, if you're born again, if you're on your way to heaven, he's talking to us. The vocation isn't, well, my job, I am a plumber, I'm an electrician, I am an office man, I'm a banker, I'm a teller, I'm a fire. He's not talking about that vocation, not an earthly vocation. He's talking about a heavenly calling that God puts on all of his children. And he says that we are all called. It's not maybe called, you are called to this. Now, we could say those prisoners on death row should not have had their sentences commuted. They are not worthy of that. If God saved your soul, first of all, we weren't worthy of it because we had a death sentence on our souls. And God asks and instructs us through the writings of Paul, would you please just live a life that's worthy of it? Which means it's possible to live in such a way that is unworthy of it. And if you remember in the book of Ephesians chapter 5, we memorized some of these verses. Look what it says, verse number 1. Be ye therefore followers of God, as dear children. He said, this is how you walk worthy of God. And he's trying to help these new Christians understand that certain things that we do cause us to be unworthy of the vocation where we are called to. And this is that list where he says in verse number 3, but fornication, meaning children of God shouldn't fornicate. That is something we should not do. We should do the opposite of that, meaning we should be holy and clean. And all uncleanness or covetousness, meaning as a child of God, if I'm going to be worthy of salvation, not that I'm earning it, get that out of your head. We're not talking about earning salvation. We're asking, are we living in such a way that is, God could say, this is a worthy action. If you're a covetous Christian, you're not living a worthy lifestyle. He continues on, covetousness, let not be once named among you, as becometh saints, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather of giving thanks. We could go on and on. He talks about being drunk with wine. He talks about all these verses are instructing children of God how to live a worthy life. Now, today we're just going to focus on the worthy calling. You see that again. Look back at verse number 1, chapter number 4. Walk worthy of the vocation wherewith ye are called. Now, the calling of God on his children is a responsibility placed at our feet. He's not talking about a phone ringing, ring, 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 and it's a call. A call is a purpose and a challenge. God has given his folks, his church, and Paul was telling this church at Ephesus, hey, God has a call for you, a purpose for you. And the difference is not any different from 2,000 years ago from today. Frontier Baptist Church this year, we have a calling. We have a purpose here. We're not just meeting together on Sundays and Sunday nights and Wednesday nights because there's nothing else for us to do. We don't give of our tithes and our offerings just because. We don't have ministries just because. We have all of those things because there is a calling that God has put at the feet of Frontier Baptist Church. And I would encourage you to be a part of that. Man, there's all kinds of things that we can be a part of, but there is nothing greater to be a part of than a local New Testament church. Your time spent here is never in vain if it's in the right spirit and the right mind. He encourages them, hey, he uses the word walk. Now, we've heard this term before, and he's not necessarily referring to how you walk. All right, you can sometimes see a person walks a certain way. He's talking about how you live your life. He says that you walk worthy. He's not saying that when you walk, you have to walk in such a way that is worthy. He's talking about that as you go about your life, it is a life that is worthy of the calling of God. This old saying is, does your walk talk louder than your talk talks. Whoa, that's way too early in the morning for that. I haven't even had lunch yet. Let me say that again. And it's a true statement. Your walk will talk louder than your talk talks. Okay? I can tell you that I'm the strongest man in here, that I can lift 1,000 pounds with one finger over my head. I can talk a lot. Now, when we go to the gym and you say, prove it, oh, can't actually do it. You can sit here and say, I'm a Christian and I love God, but this week, can you back it up? You can sit here and say, I'm a good husband. According to God's word, can you back that up? Can your walk prove what you say about your own self? See, we are the greatest defenders of our own selves. Man, if you criticize me, I will have a response just like that. Why? Because I will defend my walk. Okay? Paul says to the church at Ephesus, will you walk worthy? The idea here is, does your life, does what you do, is it honoring God or is it dishonoring God? Now this church, I want to remind you, they had all kinds of immoral habits. They were coming from inappropriate homes and things that were taught and common in society. I mean, it was just common to do terrible things. And so they were trying to learn that this is bad. I mean, like when you go to certain places, I mean, now it's coming into America, which is such a crazy thing. It used to be a foreign idea to the United States that prostitution was wrong. Now there are places that people would say, well, it's legal, so I can do it. And so that's the type of mentality Paul is trying to address, that just because you can do it doesn't mean it's honoring God. Just because of what your flesh, he's trying to get them to understand that now you Gentiles, you're supposed to be God's people, so you need to live like God's people. And just because you can do certain things doesn't mean you should. And there are some things as Christians that we should do. As a Christian, he gives a list of those things. We should not covet. We should not be filthy. We should not be idolaters. Those things are things we should not do. And so the question Paul is putting forth here today is, are you living worthy of the calling? Could God call you a Christian? I just want you to leave with that here today. We're going to get some points with that. But the crux of today is, are you worthy to be called a Christian? Lots of people say, well, I am a Christian. Okay, do you even know what that word means? Christian doesn't mean saved. Christian means Christ-like. Christian is a follower of Christ. They were so much like Christ, they called them Corinthians. Another reason you don't want to be a Mormon or a Muslim. Anyway, that's a whole other point. I want to be a follower of Christ. Meaning that somebody looked at me and said, you are so much like Jesus, you must be like Christ. Christian. And Paul tells the Ephesians, you should live in such a way that people could call you worthy to be a Christian. Nobody would say, look, if I just went and I was the drug dealer of Durango, and I was the connection for all the bad things that took place in Durango. We don't have to be super smart to understand these things. Coulter, you don't have a high school education yet, right? But if I was a drug dealer, do you think that would honor God? Now, are you sure? Now, we can get a little tricky. Be like, but doesn't God accept me the way that I am? Doesn't God love me? That would get a little tricky, huh? But that's the idea that gets into all these contemporary churches, that I can just do whatever I want. doesn't God accept me? God accepts you at salvation the way you are, but he changes you afterwards. And Paul is telling the Ephesians, it's not okay to do the things that your society says are okay. He's trying to get them to understand, women, it's not okay to be a prostitute. Men, it's not okay to go to those places. He's trying to get them to understand that God doesn't want you to stay the way that you were when you get saved. He wants you to change and live a life that is worthy of his calling. Now, don't have the attitude that says, well, you're just trying to make me to be this today. No, God's trying to make you be something today. The reason we have preaching isn't so somebody can just get up from a wood pulpit and try to beat you up across the head spiritually. The point of preaching is to say, hey, this is what your flesh wants to do, and this is what you need to do. Look, our flesh wants to do bad things. That's the sin nature. It's the old man. Paul even addresses it in this book later in chapter 4 and in chapter 5 and chapter 6. You got to put the old man away, and he's trying to get them to understand you have to change the way you live your life. Meaning, you're going to have to go different places. You're going to have to talk a certain way. Again, not to earn salvation. Again, I'm going to have to keep repeating that because people get this idea that you got to earn it by the way you live your life. No. But you're going to talk different, meaning that I shouldn't swear, I shouldn't take the name of the Lord in vain, I shouldn't tell dirty jokes, right? Meaning I should have good habits, meaning I should go to places that are honoring to the Lord. I should watch things that are honoring to the Lord. I should listen to things that are honoring to the Lord. Why? Because am I trying to earn my salvation? No. I could never do that. But God says there is a way that you can walk that is worthy of his calling. Now that's awesome. That means it's possible. Do you understand that? Have you ever looked at something and thought, oh, that's impossible? Maybe a job, maybe something going on that you're trying to get done at your house. And you're like, oh man, that is impossible. You know what I love about this? That means it is possible to walk worthy to be called a Christian. That's awesome. So you should take it as a personal challenge today that says, God, I want to walk worthy of this calling. Again, Paul's trying to get these guys to understand that there is a change that needs to take place. Now, we use that word walk, and that refers to a way a person lives their life. Often you can define a person often by the way they live their lives. If you were to follow me all week long and saw where I walk, now, again, back then they didn't have cars, so don't get smart on me. They walked pretty much everywhere they went. And so you could know a lot about a person by where they walked. You could say today, if you followed me all week and followed me everywhere I drove, you would know a lot about me. You would know if I drive to church. You would know if I drive to work. You would know when I go to work. You'd know when I get off of work. You would know when I go to the store. You understand, by just following somebody and how they live their life, you find out a lot about them. My mind goes back to this illustration. There were some overzealous men in college, young men. They would brag about how spiritual they are in their relationships. And I remember one in particular in my head. He would talk about how, how God's really working on me. And he'd be, I'm not mocking his zealousness. But when you'd go to breakfast at 6:30 and you'd see his girlfriend sitting there reading her Bible and he's still sleeping in the dorm, your walk isn't matching your talk, especially when you told her you'd be there in that morning to have devotions. You understand how that walk doesn't match the talk? Let me ask you, does your walk match your talk? You can say, well, I'm a member. It's funny, people will come here once, ever. They'll come here one time, and I'll hear them in town. My pastor's Pastor Reitz. You met him one time. How is he your pastor? That doesn't match up. There's somebody who's not even a member here who claims that they were the pastor here and that they're a member of this church, and they tell everybody, I'm like, you're not a member of this church. The walk does definitely not match the talk. You're talking, running your mouth. You can run your mouth all day long and you can say, yeah, I love God, but unless you go and serve him this week, we're not walking worthy. That's what Paul's trying to get these folks to understand, is we have to change. That sounds really hard to some. And some of us, if we were honest, we'd say, yeah, we do need to. Okay, so let's look at some of those things with the few minutes that we have left. Turn to chapter number 2. This calling, first of all, is ordained, meaning it was set up. There was a plan. This piano, I know this, I'm a real deep preacher, I know. This piano is not a car. You're like, wow, mind blown. It's not a car. The creator of this piano had an ordained purpose for its use. Pastor said this several times, and it's true. God ordained and destinates for service or use, not for salvation. When you get saved, God has a preordained purpose. This piano may want to be a car. It's not. This piano may want to be a plane. It's never going to be that. And some Christians are so unhappy because they're not being used for what God ordained them to be used for. Now, we could take this piano, it's a Baldwin, this piano in no wise is a piano. Thousands of dollars. That's why we got to take care of these things. That's why pastor doesn't like kids just up here slamming around on it. It's a expensive tool that we use to help us worship the Lord. Now, if we took this piano, and next week you came to visit the fire station, and I had a 100-ton fire tender with 3,000 gallons of water with the tires off, and this piano shoved up underneath that fire engine, holding it up, you'd say, what are you doing? That's not what that's for. That's a piano. That's supposed to be played. What are you're using? That should never be underneath a truck or a trailer. It should be in a church. It should be played beautifully by God-given talent to bring honor to the Lord. What are you doing with that underneath a greasy fire engine? I wonder if that's often looks at our lives saying, what are you doing? What are you doing with the life that I gave you? Young people, I've given you talent. I've given you a good church. What are you doing in the world? You're using your life for something it should never have been used for. You're going to places, that's not where you should be. A piano shouldn't be in a fire bay underneath an engine. Christian, you shouldn't be in a bar. Christian, you shouldn't be in a state of despair. You understand what he's saying here? It is an ordained position, meaning that piano has a purpose and a place. You as a child of God have an ordained purpose and a place. Look what it says in Ephesians 2:10. For we, okay? We means everybody. It's very collective, and I love the Bible. It is very inclusive. We are his, what's that next word? We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works. Meaning, as a child of God, we should be doing good works. Meaning, going to church is a good work. Going to be a witness is a good work. Giving the missions is a good. Those are things. Good things are things we're supposed to do. Unto good works, which God hath before. What's that next word? Ordained that we should what? Oh, there's that word walk. You understand? He is telling these pagan, look, so Jews, they had the Old Testament. They had the law. Most Jews back in this day and age grew up knowing morals, knowing, don't do this, don't do that, eating clean, separating, a life of separation, not for salvation, a life of separation. Jews grew up with that in their culture. These Ephesians had no idea about any of that. And so Paul is explaining to them, hey, when you get saved, God has a plan for you after you get saved. Just like a piano, after it's made, it has a purpose. And God says, hey, God has ordained good works that we should walk in them. So this year, are you going to walk in good works that make you worthy to be called a Christian or unworthy? These are ordained purposes. Just like a builder, when he gets the blueprints, he is supposed to follow the blueprints. God has given you a blueprint for your family. God has given you a blueprint for your children. God has given you a blueprint for your week, for your day, for your job, for your finances, for your church. This is the blueprint. We're supposed to walk in this. And if it's not a big deal to you, let me just tell you, there's no way you're the Christian you're supposed to be. Say, I don't like that. Well, that's what God's word said. You don't like it, you stand before God and you argue with him about it. He says that these are ordained that we should walk in them. Now, turn to Ephesians 4. This is a calling that has been ordained, meaning you don't get to pick it. It is ordained in Christ Jesus. You don't get to pick and choose, well, this is my truth, and that's just your truth. No, this is God's truth. It is God ordained. If you have this idea that I can live as a Christian however I wish, you are sadly mistaken. It is ordained. Now, secondly, it is a call that is different. Look what it says in Ephesians 4, verse number 17. This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord that ye henceforth, what's that next word? Walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind. It is an ordained calling, and it is a different calling. Meaning, I've said this before, if you're a Christian, you should look, walk, talk, act, be different than other Gentiles. Again, in this society in Ephesus, there were things that were just common habits. Everybody knew that everybody did these things. And he said, hey, Ephesians, you've got to walk not as the other Gentiles. Meaning you're going to have to change some things. Now, I'm just going to put it, it's going to be a little bit more pointed in this day and age, because what makes you different than a Catholic? Are Catholics good people? Generally speaking, sure. I know lots of good Catholics. Do Catholics go to church? Yeah. Some Catholics go to church more faithfully than some supposed Christians. Do Catholics give to their religion? Do Catholics give to the poor? Do Catholics give of their time to help? No. Mother Teresa did a lot of good stuff. I'm not knocking that. Do Catholics pray to God? Yeah. So what makes you any different than a Catholic? Because I don't want to be a Catholic, I want to be a Christian. So how are you different than a Mormon? Do Mormons go to church? Yeah. Do Mormons pray to God? Do Mormons serve? Man, some Mormons are better servants than some Christians, man. I have a neighbor, or two Mormon missionaries came over, and they, you know how they do. They said, is there anything we can do for you? She had them chop 3 cords of wood, stack it next to her house. I was waiting for them to come to my house because I had a list. Just kidding. I wasn't going to do that. Does Mormons serve? Yeah. They'll actually do that. They had some come to our pastor's house and they helped him with stuff. Do Mormons serve? Do Mormons teach Sunday school? Do Mormons teach junior church? Do Mormons read their Bible? Do Mormons go on mission trips? If you're a true Mormon, every Mormon will give 2 years of their life on a mission. So what makes you any different? You're walking like other Gentiles. You understand where this gets a little bit more personal? Just because you come here doesn't make you different. Just because you put money in that plate doesn't make you different. Just because you pray over your food doesn't make you different. So what makes you different? It is a different calling. And Paul said that we should walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind. 9 out of 10 of those people in those other religions, 9 out of 10 of them, good statistic of them, will do those things because they're trying to earn their salvation. My cousin that I was just talking to, she grew up in a Catholic church and she can't stand church because of that. She said, I got so tired of going every week, taking the communion for my salvation. That's why they do it. The reason they go on their missionary trips, the reason they give money, that's what those churches teach, that if you don't do those things, you don't go to heaven. That is vain. It is empty works. Meaning, as a child of God, when I come to church, if I just come empty and I'm just here, it's because it is just as good as if I was to go sitting in a Presbyterian church this morning. Meaning, when I come here, it needs to be different in here. The vanity of their mind, it's a personal decision. You could be living your life as a child of God as worthless as any so-called religious person if it's not meaning something here. He says you got to walk not as other Gentiles, because these people in Ephesus, they had temples. The Jews had a temple. They had a temple. They had a God they worshiped. They had a God they worshiped. So what makes it different here? It is ordained calling. It is a different calling. Now look what it says in Ephesians 5 as we wrap this up. And it is a calling that is exampled. Ephesians 5:2. Hopefully you have this memorized. And what's that word? Oh, one more time. And one more time. And all right, good. Walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us. Meaning, you should live in such a way that is the example of Christ. And I've told this to the teens, and I tell every teenager that ever sits under any kind of preaching or teaching that I do, I don't want you to be like me at all. I want you to be better than me. In fact, I want you to be like Christ. He's the example. We're not trying to create mini so-and-sos here. We're trying to walk like Christ walked. So, do you think Jesus would do the things that you do? If the answer is no, then you're not walking like Christ. You have to consider, what is the example you're following? And walk in love as Christ also hath loved us and hath given himself for us an offering. Now, sometimes when we think about Christianity, we think, man, it's going to be a sacrifice. Man, if I serve the Lord, this will change this. This will change my finances. This will change my priorities. This will change, we put a huge price on serving God. But the example is given here. He gave himself for an offering. He went to hell. That's the example. Meaning you and I have no excuse for why we can't walk in love. Because he's the example. If anybody had an excuse not to die and go to hell, the perfect person who never did anything wrong, I think he has a pretty good excuse. He didn't deserve that. But he gives us the example. If anybody shouldn't have washed the feet of the disciples, especially Judas, Jesus shouldn't have had to have done that. Now, Peter, he said, man, you ain't gonna touch my feet. You ain't worthy of that. He spoke correctly, but Christ was trying to show him an example. And the example was that we are supposed to follow his actions, not the actions of each other. So again, I'm not trying to get you to say, what would Luke do? The question is, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus go to church faithful? He did. Would Jesus forgive? He did. Would Jesus be patient? He is and he was. Was Jesus concerned about others? He was and he still is. The thing about Jesus is he's not changed. He still loves you. He loved you 2,000 years ago when he took the nails, your and my nails, in his hands on that tree. He loved us 2,000 years ago. You know, sometimes you'll hear a marriage is, well, I used to love him or I used to love her. Well, if you follow the example of Christ, that won't change. You might change, but he's the example. It is an ordained calling. It is a different calling. It is a calling that is exampled. And lastly, it is a calling that is exalted. Look what it says in Ephesians chapter 5, and we'll wrap this up. Ephesians 5, verse number 15. Now, nobody like that I know of really wants to be known as the garbage man of Durango, right? It's like not a worthy calling. It's not like something to really brag about. I mean, you can be proud of what you do, but nobody's like, I take everyone's trash from their house. I'm being silly. But I want you to understand what God calls you to is no silly thing. It is literally the highest calling any human being could possibly have on their life. I know somebody who received a job application. They asked the individual to apply. They said, we want you to apply to be the chief of staff for the Secretary of Defense. It wasn't me. I know, shocker, right? You're like, well, it was you, wasn't it? Yeah, they want me to be the chief of staff. Yeah, no, it wasn't me. I probably will never get an email asking me to apply for that job. And I think about that person. I think about how honoring, how esteemed to be asked to apply to be the chief of staff for the Secretary of Defense of the United States. My mind goes back to when I was a teenager and there was a conference called the Higher Call Conference. Being called to serve God is of greater esteem than if you were to ask me to be the President of the United States. But most Christians don't believe that. God says his calling is to be esteemed. Look what he says here. Ephesians 5:15, see then that ye walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. Meaning, if you were to live your life for any other reason other than what God has called you to do, you are an absolute fool. This year, God has a purpose for you. This year, God has a purpose for Frontier Baptist Church. And if we don't fulfill the ordained, the different call, and all the other things you said, we would be fools to be here. Serving God is an exalted calling. And if you are saved here today, it is no joke. It is more important than anything this world could ever offer you. Even David knew that. He said, I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God. He's the king of God's chosen people. Do you understand what an honor that is? God chose you out of all the other Jews to make David king of Israel, the united tribes, the first united kingdom. God chose David. And that the Messiah promised to Adam and Eve would come through his line and sit on his actual throne. David says, I'd rather just be close to God and serve him at his house. Christians get mad that they have to do certain things. It's my turn to do what now? Maybe we have the wrong idea about what it is we do. Maybe we don't understand the calling that God has put on us. So the challenge is, are we walking worthy? We could go on for the sake of time. If you're curious, I'd challenge you this week. The key to help us walk worthy of the calling are in chapter 4. For your devotions this week, if you really want to know how do I walk worthy, read chapter 4 and apply it. It's found through humility. It's found in unity. It's found in ministry. And it's found in maturity. That's where he says, be not as children. He tells them that you need to be serving. If you're not serving in church, there's no way you're walking worthy. He says, hey, we are of one baptism, one Spirit, one God. He says, hey, we've got to be unified. We can't have division in the church. And it all starts with that humility. Let's go ahead and we'll bow our heads and close our eyes, and I'll have the pianist make her way to the piano. I don't think some of those individuals were worthy of the Presidential Medal of Honor. But if you're a child of God, you have something of higher honor wrapped around your heart. That's the very presence of God. Paul here, this first Sunday, we're looking at how to walk worthy of the calling. Worthy of the calling. God has called you. Are you living a way that is worthy of it? Now, sometimes we face these decisions in our life and we're like, man, I don't know that I ever could be. I've got too much baggage. I've got too much mistakes. I've got too much I'm dealing with. God, I don't believe that's something I can achieve. Look, the person writing these verses was a mass murderer. He went from a mass murderer to one of the greatest Christians that we know today. If God can do that with Paul, may I encourage you, God can do that with you. Maybe you feel like, man, my marriage isn't honoring God. Well, it can if you'd let him work through you. Maybe a young person says, well, I'm doing stuff that isn't honoring the Lord. I'm around bad friends. I'm around bad habits. I listen to bad music. I do bad things. God, I'm so sorry, but I don't think I can. You can. See, God knows we're creatures of dirt. Look, I'm a creature of dirt. I've got stuff I deal with. All of us are made of creatures of dirt, and God can change us and turn us into beautiful things. Won't you let God use you this year? Will you let God make your year your purpose? And if you're not saved here today, if you're trying to earn your way to heaven, there's no way you could be worthy of that. The only way you can get to heaven is you have to accept the gift that you could not earn. Salvation is a gift. It is not earned by church attendance or a dollar bill or any other currency found under heaven. You have to accept Christ as your personal Savior. You can do that right there as you sit. You don't have to be baptized. You don't have to sing a song. But Christian, are you walking worthy? A worthy walk. Let's stand to our feet with our heads bowed and our eyes closed.